what we're here to talk about this morning is the future workplace. Uh, this is us. I'll let you work out, obviously, who is who. No prizes for that. So obviously, if we're looking ahead, I suppose, to where we're going, it's the first place we should really think about is where did we start from? Uh, I think you both and everyone online will know where this picture is from. And if I asked you to imagine yourself even now in a sort of traditional office space, I'd say this is still pretty close to what you'd picture. Uh, the computers probably be a bit smaller. You probably won't have a landline phone anymore. I don't think anyone does now. You do? Wow. But a lot of the key indicators really are still there. You know, we have a group of directly employed staff. They work regular hours, 9 to 5, all from the same building, from the same room every day. So where are we going? And that's what we're talking about this morning, is how the workplace is changing, where it might be in the future. And obviously the conversation on flexible and remote working models are continuing to evolve. During the pandemic, many commentators were sure that home working was the future. There was no going back. Businesses were either going to have to adapt or essentially be unable to hire or retain any staff. It's undoubtedly true that in many industries, flexible working has been a success, and employees have enjoyed a better work-life balance, less time commuting, and they have become more productive. But it is equally true that many businesses which initially leaned heavily into remote flexible working are now trying to encourage their staff back into the office. Most are citing the importance of meeting colleagues in person, that they need to do that to drive collaboration, to foster teamwork, and to create a shared organizational culture. So even when we were finalizing this talk in the last few days, we've seen news that Amazon are bringing all of their staff back into the office 100% of the time. And I think the civil service in England have just confirmed that they're going to operate their 60% in office policy as well. We have seen a succession of what we would probably say are mostly extremely wealthy business tycoons, sorry, Alan, criticize home working. Granted, they're usually criticizing home working from their choice of yacht or mansion or penthouse in London somewhere. But it's clear that there is a real debate now about what the future workplace is going to look like. But to take it a step back again, it's worth remembering that remote working isn't new. The UK government published a report on the impact of the pandemic on remote and hybrid working in 2022. And that found that immediately before the pandemic started in 2019, 12% of employees already worked from home at least one day each week. And within that 12%, 5% worked mainly from home. So during the pandemic, those figures did increase dramatically at the peak in June 2020, which I think was the first lockdown. I try to forget. 49% of employees worked at least one day from home, and 38% of those worked exclusively from home. So that's essentially about half the workforce. Those numbers, sorry, that's during the peak of COVID in 2020. Those numbers have tracked downwards since, down to 25% in 2022, 13% exclusively working from home. That's according to the ONS. But overall, the figures do suggest that the amount of home workers have essentially doubled since the pandemic. And we have to remember that these figures aren't broken down by industry. So there are lots of jobs that obviously can't be done from home at all. And there are a lot of industries or sectors that are not early adapters, you know, that are moving slightly after the trend. So those figures are likely much higher. You know, they're very likely much more than 25% of people who are working from home, who can work from home. And it is most likely that those who can now do, at least to some degree. As a quick aside, in our research for today, we've uncovered the most popular day to work from home. I don't know if you could guess what it is. There's probably two favorite.
Monday.
They
Friday work from home, wouldn't it be?
Well, they are the two that I thought it would be, but it is actually Tuesday, which clocks in at 67% compared to 65 for Friday or 58 for Monday. And I have no idea why. I've probably given more thought to that than anything else. But so obviously, the pandemic was an exceptional and unforeseeable event, and it did act as a major catalyst for new work practices, but it also worked in combination with other drivers that are still present today. And ultimately, it's going to be these drivers that dictate the long-term future of how we work. And just looking at a few of those, firstly, technology is making it easier and easier for businesses to hire people to work remotely. And service providers are starting to fill the compliance gaps that companies face to make that remote hiring process easier. Lots of companies and individual employees have growing concerns about climate issues. ESG is now at the forefront of most board agendas, and this is making the regular commute and business travel much less acceptable. Recent studies from Deloitte and McKinsey have shown shifting generational expectations, and Gen Z and millennials in particular are now prioritizing work-life balance and flexibility in terms of the overall package that they want from their employer. And lastly, and maybe the most importantly, the genie is now out of the bottle. Many employees have now worked flexibly for years, whether they started doing that before or during the pandemic, and they just don't want to change back. So where we are now is that most employees in service industries, and we're thinking IT, software development, recruitment, law, accountancy, and so on, expect some degree of flexible working. They just will not join a company that wants them to work in the office every day. And if they are able to work from home every day, the next question is, why shouldn't they swap their home office in Belfast for a slightly warmer one in Spain, in Portugal or Italy or somewhere else? On the other hand, there has been a kickback. To pick on Alan again, he's a good example. Many of the world's biggest tech and finance companies, Google, Apple, Shopify, Morgan Stanley, Amazon this week, these companies were all at the front of the initial trend towards full flexibility for staff, and they are now requiring staff to come either back into the office full time or some of the time. So why are they doing this? There is a growing recognition that remote working maybe isn't the perfect future that we were all promised after all. We've mentioned that there are concerns about creating cohesive teams, creating organizational cultures. We work with a huge number of companies who are making this change back towards hybrid working models. And they do usually cite issues mainly with training and upskilling junior staff, and then managing all of the other regular workplace problems that we have around performance issues and attendance that just become that bit harder to manage when we work entirely remotely. And it's worth remembering as well that hybrid or remote working will not work for everyone. On an individual level, the boundary between home and work can become blurred. The UK currently doesn't have any regulation around a right to disconnect like we've seen in Ireland or France or some other EU countries. And some employees do report worsened mental health. Home working can highlight other societal inequalities. For example, it is easier to work from home if you own your own house and you can have a dedicated home office space. And that obviously isn't the case for everyone. So with all of that in mind, this morning we're going to look at some of the key factors that we think are shaping the future workplace at the moment. The first of these are the three different legal models that are available to you to engage with staff, whether as directly hired employees, as freelancers, or through an employer of record, and why each of these are important and different from each other. Secondly, what are an employee's legal rights to flexible working? Because obviously this is something it's been in the news recently, and it's changed in England since the Labour government came in. how to say no to flexible working requests, which is something that we are asked about a lot at the moment. The benefits and the drawbacks with using freelancers and contractors, using an employer of record to hire globally, and then some practical and legal tips for protecting your business if you do allow a flexible or a remote working model. So Emma is going to start us off by explaining the most traditional way to engage staff, which is as directly hired employees.
Okay, so firstly, what is an employee? In the legislation, the employment rights and over here, it is defined as an individual who has entered into or who works under a contract of employment, which might seem obvious. It means that they work for you, the company, rather than themselves. And you're probably thinking, why is employment status important? Like, what does that mean for me and my business? So people who have employee employment status have the highest level of employment rights when compared to workers or self-employed people. But in return, they have the highest level of obligation towards their employer. So it's a two-way street. Someone is likely to be classed as an employer or an employee, pardon me, for example, if they are paid through payroll, if they are required to be available except when on holiday to do their work, if they can't refuse the work that you give them, if they can't get someone else to do their work, if they are paid holiday and sick leave, if they're subject to your disciplinary and grievance procedures, and if they have to give notice for any type of special leave like maternity leave, paternity leave, or adoption leave. Also, they would be more likely to be an employee if you decide exactly what work they're given, when they do it, how they do it, and if you provide the tools for them to do that work. So if you think about it and you're thinking about a particular individual and most of the above apply, they're more likely to be an employee than self-employed or a worker. And the classification again is exceptionally important because, as we discussed there, employees have more employment rights than self-employed individuals or workers. So for example, national right to make a flexible working request, but in return, as we said, it's a two-way street. So they have an obligation during their contracted hours to act in good faith and in the interests of your business. So a main takeaway for employers, and it's extremely important, is that the main differences between self-employed individuals and employees that employees have unfair dismissal rights. That if the relationship isn't working out and employment is going to be terminated, then they are entitled to statutory minimum notice, depending on their length of service, of course. But if you do not follow statutory dismissal procedure, you could end up with a claim for unfair dismissal.
Okay, so in comparison to an employee, what is a freelancer or a contractor? Because I know certainly with startup companies and companies that are scaling, these are terms that we all use and we sort of use them interchangeably. And they can describe a variety of things. But at its simplest, it's another way of describing someone who provides services to you, to your business, on a self-employed basis. And the best way to think about someone who is a truly self-employed freelancer or contractor is that they are in business for themselves, like you, and you are their client for whatever the services that they're providing to you are. We can compare this in a really simple way with a standard employee, who, like Emma has said, is someone who works for your business rather than their own business. So when we talk about employment status, this can be for either employment law purposes or for tax purposes. These are two separate concepts, although they do link up together. Employment law status is about what employment rights someone must receive from you. And that's what Emma's described in terms of paid holiday, sick pay, flexible working rights, which we'll get on to, as well as protections from unfair dismissal, notice pay, redundancy pay on termination. Tax status is about what the payments you make to them, whether they should be taxable as income. Employees are always paid through payroll, and you as their employer are responsible for making any tax deductions from what you pay them. Self-employed freelancers can be paid their fee, whether that's a daily rate or if you're paying them based on a deliverable that they're completing for you. Usually just by submitting an invoice, you pay them on foot of the invoice without making any tax deductions, because that freelancer is their own business and they're responsible for their own tax affairs. And this is one of the main benefits of the freelancing arrangement for you, and indeed for them, because they will usually pay less tax than an employee would. And we do see in some industries, IT in particular, employees who leave and then contract again on a freelance basis. And usually that is to deliver a tax benefit for them. Some freelancers will have their own limited company, which you contract with, and the limited company then provides that individual services to you. This is what's called a personal service company. And most people in these circles have heard, at least of the IR35 rules, as a sort of dark thought or a dark cloud at the back of their minds. We won't go into detail about that today, because these rules don't apply to small businesses with a turnover of less than 10.2 million, balance sheet less than 5.1 million. But if they do apply, essentially you become responsible as the end client of the services for making income tax deductions. So it closes a tax loophole that freelancer would benefit from otherwise. The differences between an employee and someone who is a self-employed freelancer are not always clear cut, and they involve weighing up several factors. Firstly, you will have fewer obligations towards freelancers. You don't need to give them work to do. You don't need to pay their holidays or sick pay. But on the other hand, they can usually refuse particular assignments from you. And when they finish the work that they've agreed to do for you, there's no ongoing relationship anymore. Secondly, you have less control over freelancers because, again, they work for themselves and not for you. You usually can't dictate when they work, where they work, or how they go about completing particular pieces of work for you. And if something goes wrong, you can't put them through your internal disciplinary or grievance processes like you would with an employee. Your entire relationship with them is effectively controlled by the terms of the contract that you have with them. Thirdly, freelancers are usually less integrated into your business in the sense that they might use their own office space. They may use their own hardware, their own laptops, computers, etc. And they may use their own software and processes to do the work for you. The most important factor is whether you require that freelance contractor to provide a personal service to you. And if we look at employees, they always provide a personal service. If you employ someone, they can't say, I don't fancy coming in today, but it's okay. Joe Bloggs is going to do it for me. But a contractor may be able to provide a substitute to do their work for them if you agree to that. And that is about as close as it comes to there being a sort of a silver bullet factor that makes someone self-employed, is that ability to provide a substitute. This difference is something that's been highly contested in recent years. There have been a number of very high-profile cases going right up to the UK Supreme Court, mainly involving gig economy platforms like Uber and Deliveroo, but also a number of TV presenters for BBC and ITV and Sky and so on. And indeed, this week, the Supreme Court published a judgment in a very controversial case that was brought by HMRC against PGMOL, who are the professional referee body for football in England. And that case was about whether referees are employees from the point that they accept a fixture from PGMOL to when they submit their match report at the end of the game, and whether they should pay tax on the payments that they get. And the Supreme Court actually agreed that there was enough obligation and control passing between those individual referees and PGMOL for that distinct time period from when they accept a fixture to completing their report, that there could be an employment contract in that time, which makes that actually quite an interesting case for us, because these referees are now likely to be employees for the purpose of the income tax that they pay, but probably not for employment law purposes. So why does this matter? There are obviously lots of benefits and drawbacks from using freelancers compared to directly hiring your staff. The most obvious is that using freelancers can reduce your payroll costs because you obviously aren't paying employer national insurance contributions. You're not making employer pension contributions. You're just paying out a flat fee. Employees aren't just interested in their gross salary. They want the net amount that they get in their hands to be meaningful after tax. But a freelancer will usually recognize that since they keep the entire fee that you give them, that can help you negotiate a daily rate or a fee structure that works for you as well. From a legal perspective, the most important difference is that freelancers don't have employment rights. They aren't entitled to things like the national minimum wage for the amount of work that they do for you. They aren't entitled to minimum notice to terminate. They can't claim for unfair dismissal. And if the work that you need them to do runs out, they aren't entitled to any redundancy rights or a redundancy payment. So this does allow you to take a much more agile and responsive approach to your staffing or your resourcing needs. And that is obviously especially important if you're starting or scaling up. But this flexibility is a two-way street. Contractors can usually terminate with much less notice than you would require from an employee. A contractor may be able to turn work from you down because they're busy or because they're unavailable, where an employee is locked in to work for you during their working hours. At a higher level, this means that you can usually expect a higher turnover with freelancers because that level of commitment on both sides of the arrangement is much lower. Where in an employment relationship, both parties are committing to each other. There is a really high level of legal obligation between both of you. And this can get you a greater buy-in, which again is something that's really, really important when you're trying to grow something. So when we think about flexibility, you shouldn't expect freelancers to work from your office. They are much more likely to work remotely or wherever they choose to work from. They will usually do things their way, and you will be paying them based on the results that they generate for you. This obviously can be an issue if you're trying to create a cohesive team, especially in a smaller business where you do have a smaller team who need to work together and collaborate together. And it can also be an issue if you need a freelancer to follow very specific methodologies or processes that you want to use. But as remote working technology becomes more advanced, it is easier and easier to engage contractors who are based both inside and outside the UK. And there is a huge benefit to this in you can tap in to a global talent pool, and that allows you obviously to obtain very specific skills and services. And over the last 5 years or so, we have seen a huge expansion in freelance work platforms, things like Upwork, Fiverr, Freelancer, that basically act as a marketplace for you to engage freelance contractors to work for you. And engaging remote overseas workers on a freelance basis does have major benefits compared to trying to employ someone in those same circumstances. Because a freelancer is self-employed, you aren't responsible for paying tax on their income, meaning that you don't need to register for payroll or for tax purposes in the country they're located in. And this is a major headache with employees who want to work remotely outside the UK, which again we'll come on to. Equally, there can be drawbacks. Your relationship with an employee isn't limited to what's in the contract. When you employ someone, there's a whole body of rules and regulations from employment legislation and court decisions that you can rely on when something goes wrong. It makes it extremely important that any contract that you have with a freelancer contains all of the commercial protections that you will need, especially around your confidential information and your intellectual property. The basic position in the UK is that there are two tiers of confidential information. The first is trade secrets, and the second is what we call mere confidential information. The difference between them can be complicated, but essentially a trade secret is is the type of information that has the highest level of protection. The example I always use is that a trade secret is like the secret recipe for HP sauce. You know what's in it, but you don't know what the recipe is. It's something that's special and it's specific to you. Employees have an implied or unwritten duty to protect your confidential information and trade secrets during their employment. But once their employment ends, this duty only applies to that highest category of trade secrets. Employment contracts will usually contain clauses which protect your confidential information during and after employment ends. Making sure you have this protection is especially important with freelancers because they don't have that same unwritten implied duty of confidentiality, because your entire relationship with them is essentially what's in the terms of the contract that you have. Similarly, with employees, the default position is that any IP rights which they create in the course of their employment will belong to you as their employer. But with freelancers, again, this general rule doesn't apply, meaning that if a freelancer creates protectable intellectual property for you, something which is patentable, something which is copyrightable, they must assign the ownership of the rights in those works to you, or you will not own them. And obviously, owning your IP is a major legal issue, maybe the most important legal issue for a company which is starting or scaling. So it is crucial that your contracts with freelancers have suitable clauses assigning and waiving IP rights to you.
So I'm going to take us through flexible working rights. So firstly, what is flexible working? Essentially, it's a way of working that suits the employee's needs. This will vary from employee to employee as everyone has a different set of circumstances. But most commonly, flexible working requests can relate to a change in working days, working hours. Do they want staggered hours, flexible start times, compressed hours, or do they want to change their place of work completely? So in terms of the legal position, it's quite different in NI and GB following changes that came in there on the 6th of April. So in GB, employees can make a flexible working request from day one of employment. They can also make 2 every 12 months. So in NI, you're still stuck with the 26 weeks continuous service before you can make a flexible working request, and you could only make 1 per year. So if you get one, how do you go about managing it? It's important to remember that while employees have the right to ask, they don't have the right to have their request approved. Employers have a duty to consider all applications fully and establish whether the desired work pattern would work with the needs of their business, such as operational requirements. If it's not going to work, you can lawfully decline an application, but you can only do so on very specific business grounds, which we'll look at in a minute. Both of these grounds are the same in NI and GB despite the update in legislation. So as a starting point, when you get a flexible working request, you should probably look and see whether the employee has 26 weeks service as required here in Northern Ireland before they can make one. If they don't, technically speaking, they don't have the right to make it, but that doesn't mean to say that you're not willing to consider it, because it could have benefits for your business and the employee as well. So it's worth considering if you think you can make it happen. You should also look and see whether they've actually made a flexible working request. So there are very clear criteria in making one. So firstly, it must be in writing. It must state that it's a flexible working request. It must clearly explain the effect, if any, the change that they want would have for their employer. It must specify the pattern required and the date on which they want that pattern to take effect. And it must clearly state also whether they've made any previous requests in the last 12 months. It's also helpful if you have them to look at your staff handbook and flexible working policy to look for next steps on how to handle this if it ever comes your way. So the steps for managing a request in NI are very prescriptive and subject to very strict timescales. And it's very important that you don't miss a deadline or fall foul of these requirements, because you could end up with claims for automatically unfair dismissal or discrimination, as these are claims employees can bring from day one of employment. It doesn't matter how much service they have in that respect. So once you've received the request, within 28 days, you should arrange a meeting with the employee to discuss why they're making the request. You should let them know that they're allowed to be accompanied to this meeting also. It's important while discussing the request to maybe ascertain why they've made the request, because there could be more below the surface than you think. If they're making it because of a medical condition or because they have childcare obligations, if you handle that badly and you don't let a mum, leave an hour earlier or start an hour later because of the school pickup, you could end up being faced with claims for discrimination on grounds of sex. Or if someone is suffering from a disability, and you don't entertain their request and you dismiss it and don't deal with it in the right way, you could also face claims for discrimination on grounds of disability. So once you've had the chance to meet with the employee and find out why they're making the request, you should write to them within 14 days to confirm whether you're going to accept it or whether you're going to refuse it. So if you can accept it, you can confirm that in writing to the employee. You can confirm the new working arrangement and the date from which that new working arrangement will take effect. You should also advise them that the change and the granting of their flexible working request constitute a permanent change to their terms and conditions of employment. If you're not sure at this stage whether the flexible working arrangement will work, you could suggest a trial period to the employee, see how it goes, and if it doesn't work out, you're not tied to anything. Also, it could be that the employee is nervous about permanent changes to their contract and maybe doesn't want to commit to that, so a trial period might work best for everyone involved. And then if it works, obviously you can change it then down the line. So how do you say no to a flexible working request, but safely? So as I said there earlier, requests can only be refused on one or more basic specific grounds. So I'm just going to list them off here. So the first is the burden of additional costs on the business, detrimental effect on ability to meet customer demand, inability to reorganize work among your existing staff, and the inability to recruit additional staff. It could be a detrimental impact on quality or performance. Also insufficiency of work during the periods the employee would like to work. Maybe it doesn't work with the busy peak times in the business, or planned structural changes. So if you can't refuse a request neatly within those grounds, you could end up facing employment tribunal claims because of that. So for example, a good example would be an employee who works in a production line in a factory and doesn't want to work 5 days a week, only wants to work 2 days a week. That's going to have issues for production and product output. So if you're going to go ahead and refuse the request, you should write to the employee and explain which grounds apply. It's much better in circumstances such as this to write and be very open and frank and to the point about why you're refusing it. If you use convoluted language that the employee doesn't understand, they're less likely to agree with what you're saying. So you should also advise them that they can appeal your decision to refuse their request, but only on the basis that you've maybe missed facts or misunderstood facts, or there's been a change in the employee's circumstances. Other than that, they can't take that any further. So it's possible, well, it's very likely that the employee will not be happy that the request hasn't been granted. So it may be that they appeal your decision, or if you keep going down that line and you still will not approve it, they could end up issuing a grievance. And you have to handle that, of course, in line with your grievance procedure. As Jack was saying earlier, remote working grew during the pandemic, and many employees are being forced to come back to the office now, and they maybe don't want to. They're trying to encourage people back in, and ultimately you're faced with a very difficult question. How can you make someone come back in who's been working from home remotely from 2020 without any major issues? So this was considered recently in a case involving the FCA. So the claimant was a senior manager for the FCA, and her responsibilities included attending in-person meetings, running training sessions, coaching and mentoring junior staff. So on down the line, when the FCA dropped its pandemic measures and wanted people to come in 60% of the week, she wasn't happy. So then made a flexible working request to work 100% of the time from home. The FCA refused this flexible working request on the basis that while there were no performance issues with the claimant, she couldn't appropriately and fully perform her responsibilities if she was working from home. So because she coached junior staff, if there was no one around for them to ask questions to, she wouldn't be able to fulfill that obligation. So eventually she challenged the refusal in the employment tribunal and lost. The tribunal agreed with the FCA and said that they'd assessed her responsibilities before concluding that they could not accept her request. And this decision definitely is a major boost for employers who are trying to strike a balance between employees' flexibility and working from home, but also preserving their business interests, collaboration and development within their workforce. So as Jack mentioned there earlier, another option for engagement is an employer of record. So firstly, what is an employer of record? It's essentially a shell company that takes on legal and tax responsibilities for employing someone in a different country. So the idea behind it is that it allows you to sidestep all the cumbersome compliance issues that usually come up when you're trying to employ someone in a different country. Although usually there is a tax element there, you would need to make sure that you're complying with the country's tax authorities, register with them, and comply with any local laws around providing particular employment rights and benefits. And of course, that costs time and money. So the employer of record takes on these responsibilities. It is essentially the legal employer and does all the payroll and administrative duties. They provide a contract which complies with the local laws and provide the employee with the minimum employment requirements in whatever country it is that they want to work in or you want to employ them in. Of course, it is pricey, as we mentioned, so you'll pay the employer of record for the employment costs and an additional fee for their service, which is usually 20 to 40% of the employee's salary. Then on a day-to-day basis, it's very much the same. The employee works for you and is managed in the normal way. Following the pandemic, companies are engaged in employers of record more and more. So where they've expanded the recruitment efforts across the globe, that allows them to then branch out and employ talent in a range of other countries. So they're especially useful for employees that work in the UK, but say, for example, someone comes to you and says, I want to work in Spain, but you don't necessarily want to lose that employee's talent. You could say, okay, well, we'll maybe see if we can look into finding a new job in Spain. It's particularly popular among startup companies as they assume, well, EOR assumes all of the cumbersome, as I say, administration responsibilities and allows the startup to focus on actually growing their business without the need to have a HR legal team for every country they hire someone in. But of course, with everything, there are pros and cons. So while the benefits are obvious, there are several main drawbacks. The first is definitely cost. They're a service business and charge accordingly. It will usually be cheaper to negotiate a daily rate with a freelance contractor than engage an employee via an employer of record. So on the other hand, you will have a higher level of control over an EOR employee than you would have over a self-employed contractor. So you would maybe be able to tell them more what they're doing, when they're doing it, that element of control we talked about at the start. So it's a balance on what is right for your business also. The second is depending on the size of the employer of record, the level of support and involvement they can have may vary. So it's important that if something goes wrong and you need advice on how to manage the situation, according to that law of the country, that you have that support. So while the largest employers of records in the country have specific legal and HR teams who will help you manage those issues, some will really only act as a shell and you may not have any support and they won't help you deal with issues that you face. It's important to remember that they're not a get out of jail free card. The employer of record will usually insist that you indemnify or cover them against the cost of any claims brought by the employee during their employment or on termination. They will usually rely on the reason for dismissal that you've given them, which needs to be lawful under the country's laws. You won't usually have direct contract terms in place with the employee covering things like confidential information, intellectual property, or post-termination restrictions, such as a non-compete. You would need to ensure that there are appropriate terms within the employer of records contract. There are further issues about whether you can then enforce them on your behalf if something goes wrong. So you need to make sure everything is above board in that respect. More generally, employers of record are they're a new concept and the law is very much catching up. So in the UK, we don't have any employment tribunal cases at the moment looking at whether it's an effective way to avoid usual employer obligations. They're actually not permitted in every country, so they're not allowed in Brazil. So you need to make sure that they're actually allowed that they're permissible in the country before you go and decide to fire on with it. So they won't usually sidestep local immigration rules either. So you'll have to make sure that there is appropriate cover for visa sponsors and that if you're deciding to employ individuals in another country. So moving on then to how you can protect your business. So just to recap, on what we've talked about, if you decide to use a freelancer or employer of record, you should make sure that the contract terms protect your confidential information, intellectual property, and so on. So you should check whether these terms again are enforceable in that country, because there's no point in having a whole host of very robust clauses if they're not actually enforceable. You should think carefully about what flexible working means for your business, and if you have reasons for refusal, that you explain them to your employees. So where employees have flexible working arrangements, you should definitely consider practical steps you can take to firstly monitor their performance and attendance during work hours, track how they can use your internal systems to spot any misuse of your confidential information or IP at a very early stage, and if appropriate, and I can't emphasize if appropriate enough, remove system access remotely if this is justified, if something looks amiss. But that really is a last resort, because if you just revoke someone's access on a whim, that could result in claims for unfair dismissal.
Okay. And just before we come on to some of our predictions for what the workplace is going to look like over the next few years, I would probably just emphasize that these flexible options are things which businesses in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, are using. I mean, in the last week, I've had a client ask me how they can relocate a senior manager to Australia, and we're using an employer of record for that. And I've had another client who has an employee in their office in London who, for family reasons, wants to move to Romania. And we are setting up a relationship with them where they will, on a long-term basis, be employed via an employer of record structure. But while that employer of record sets their business up in Romania, they're going to be engaged as a freelance contractor. So we have someone who is going to move from being a regular full-time employee who works from an office in London, who's going to become a self-employed freelance contractor in Romania, and then is going to be employed by an employer of record and assigned back to us in the UK. So, these aren't abstract concepts. They're things that businesses are sort of working through at the moment to find solutions for themselves. Because obviously there's just a huge range of different circumstances that you might need or want to use these models in. And I suppose that brings us quite neatly on to the main problem with predicting what the future workplace is going to look like, is that it won't be binary. And we have a real issue or a tendency at the minute to look at things in binary concepts. Either we will not work from home at all, or we will work from home entirely. And it's not that simple. It's never been that simple. And there are a lot of different threads to consider, and we're just going to touch on a few of them here. While we definitely have seen a move back over the last year or two to in-person work, there is undoubtedly a focus shift towards making the time that you work less important than the value of the work that you're actually doing. So lots of employers are starting to manage and measure productivity based on results instead of essentially time in the seat. So maybe the days of being in the office and making sure you leave 15 minutes after your manager, those days might be over, maybe. And we are seeing a greater importance being attached to when you're in the office, making sure that that time that you have with colleagues is valuable and it's actually used in the right way so that you're getting the benefits of being together. So I think the main or the most likely prediction, and it's not much of a prediction, is that we're going to see businesses, or at least the best and the smartest businesses, balance the flexibility they can give staff with a blended approach where they still get the benefits of having people come together in the office regularly. However regularly that is, will obviously be dictated by the type of work that you're doing. And it's really going to be about focusing on making that in-person time meaningful, intentional, and focusing it on what you can do together, to drive collaboration and so on. It is undoubted that the level of flexibility that you can offer is going to be a key differential in the job market. And there's two ways of looking at this. The first is that it can favor the larger employers. And I think we all know sort of colloquially that the larger employers, PwCs and Deloittes and so on, are extremely flexible. And this can work in their favor, because obviously, even if they have concerns about the drawbacks of remote working, they are able to absorb those drawbacks and they can accommodate flexible working more easily, whether they do that across their entire workforce or if they can accommodate requests for flexible working on an individual basis. They simply have greater capacity to do it, compared to a smaller company. But on the other hand, it is equally true that smaller companies who are committed and who want to offer that flexibility can use it to their advantage when they're hiring and retaining staff. Flexible working is a tangible benefit to give to employees, which doesn't have a direct cost attached to it. And obviously, it can save you money because you're not having to put people up in an office space and worry about, how good the space is, how fit for purpose it is, what, perks you can offer in that office space. So that may allow smaller companies to be a lot more agile in the job market and essentially poach staff from these much larger organizations who they wouldn't necessarily get otherwise, who are just attracted to that idea of working remotely. And certainly we see, and we probably all see, LinkedIn adverts for fully remote jobs are the busiest, and they have the most applicants by far. And that is something which is going to continue. We think it's very likely that there's going to be a continued growth in the freelance market. Lots of companies in the UK are looking to address skills shortages, especially in sort of professional industries like IT, software development, etc., by leveraging what is a more global talent pool. And that is being made easier and easier, obviously by technology, but also by these freelance contractor platforms, connecting you with people across the globe. With generational attitudes changing, employer of record models are likely to become more common, as employees seek flexibility to work from where they want to work, while keeping the benefits of being an employee rather than being self-employed. A lot of people will not want to become a freelance contractor. They will not want to be responsible for their own tax affairs, for example. And sometimes it is nicer to feel that you're, as an employee, inside the tent, if you like. You're part of the organization. And many businesses will want to retain that closer relationship with people who want to leave and work from elsewhere. And EOR models are a good way for companies to really to retain talent that they want to retain, that they wouldn't be able to otherwise, or obviously to obtain talent in a global marketplace that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. And you do have a much higher level of control over someone who is your employee via an EOR compared to someone who you're contracting with on a freelance basis. Otherwise, there are a lot of other wider and more societal factors, which really we're only starting to see come through and how they're impacting the workplace and the job market. The first is age. Studies at the moment suggest that younger workers were probably the most impacted by the pandemic, by the loss of in-person training, that osmosis and learning that comes from being in an office environment with more senior colleagues or your peer group, social interaction and networking. And these are things which older workers who have been in an office or a traditional working environment pre-pandemic have already benefited from largely. But then on the contrary, younger workers, according to these same studies, are valuing flexibility much more than older workers. So we're probably, again, it's going to be about reaching a blended approach, which allows you really to keep some flexibility while gaining the benefits of a more traditional sort of working arrangement. It is undoubted that working from home has and can bring underrepresented groups either back into employment or keep them in employment. And if we take two really clear examples, returning mothers, people who've had pregnancies, they are a group who in a lot of industries drop out. Remote working is a great way of allowing people to come back. And the same, obviously, with disabled people who maybe can't commute regularly, or who have worked for years with issues caused by having to attend the office, which means they retire sooner or just can't perform at the same level that they would otherwise. The move towards working from home and it becoming more accepted commonly, has been a real panacea for people like that, because they can stay in work. Many businesses are now prioritizing ESG, like we've said, cutting down on commuting, cutting down on the big office space, is key, really, to ESG strategies. So if you are a company which is thinking about how to make yourself the most green or climate friendly, remote working is a real way to do that. And overall, I suppose what we're saying, and again, maybe it's not much of a prediction, but the most likely outcome is that where flexibility can be offered, it is here to stay. We, in most industries, will not be going back to the way it was pre-pandemic. Employers that do, and we are thinking obviously of the likes of Amazon, Google, etc., they are really leveraging their brand name and the fact that they're so attractive to employees at the moment to bring people back into the office. But even they are having problems doing it. And there's talks, at the moment, for example, about strike action and so on with Amazon in the US. So that conversation is certainly not finished. But if you're in an industry where someone can work remotely and they can do their job in the same way as if they were in an office, offering flexible working is a real way for you to get ahead, and to get and to retain the best talent. But just as a final sort of point to finish on, and this is something which was very apparent during the pandemic, not every job is capable of being worked remotely, and there is a wider societal issue about whether we're creating a two-tier workforce where we have some people who were the key workers during the pandemic who need to go into work, and then the office workers that stay at home. And then if you're a company who works in manufacturing or something that requires hands-on work, you need to be careful that you're not creating a two-tier workforce there between your admin and your support staff and so on, and the people who are actually producing what you make. So that is what we think. The story is definitely not over, but I'm not sure if any of you have any questions. I think you can type them in, and we can reply to them. And obviously, if you guys have any in the room,